Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 2 of our material in Political Science 310, U.S. Political Institutions. This week, we are talking about American political culture. So this is an appropriate first stop to understanding why our institutions might act the way they do, or maybe fail to act the way they do, as the case might be. So we will go through some of the kind of nuts and bolts of political culture just to kind of get you all on the same page as to where we're at so that the readings make a little more sense in that context. So let's go ahead and get started. The fundamental underpinnings of American political culture begin with the idea of liberalism. Liberalism, broadly speaking, is the ideas surrounding government being limited and securing personal rights, especially property rights. Now, that is not by any means an exhaustive definition. It is a principle of government and of life that has taken up entire philosophy books, volumes, libraries. But I want to start with the idea of liberalism in America stemming from John Locke, that fine looking fellow on your screen right now. John Locke stressed, and Thomas Jefferson copied his ideas, the idea of life, liberty, and property. Of course, Jefferson changed it to happiness. And I think that if we break down Locke's kind of key points or maybe key aspects of Locke, we could break that down into 3 steps that better help us understand a political culture not only in 2020, but just in general. So the first is that Locke was a social contract theorist. Government is not merely something that can just exist. It needs consent of the governed to exist and to be fundamentally sound. Second, Locke stressed the role of property and liberty for good government. In other words, that it was not enough that government just protect you from other governments, but that the highest priority of government was really securing your liberty, your freedom, and your property rights. And that was why government was allowed to exist. That's why we have given it consent to exist. In fact, Locke, like a lot of other political theorists, especially liberal political theorists, see government as a necessary evil, not necessarily a good in and of itself. So government should be limited and it should be willed by the people, that there is a common good that has to be served and that the people have to give consent. Finally, I think what is especially important for our discussion here is that Locke's ideas were revolutionary and, in fact, treasonous at the time at which he wrote them. One of the things that he came right out and said in the first couple of chapters of the second treatise was that the king is not given any sort of special power by God, but instead is granted power by the people, and that man is such an animal that without government disputes could create war. And government is a necessary evil to protect from that, but it is not a good in and of itself. Therefore, government should be primarily concerned with protecting the individual rights of people, including freedom and property rights kind of at the forefront. So the key idea here that I think we need to keep at the forefront is American liberalism is very different than liberalism elsewhere. It's unique. It's not something that has just been transported wholesale. Now, Locke was an Englishman. He never came to America. And Locke has sort of taken on new meaning in America that was not maybe intended and certainly not given in other countries. And one of the people who wrote about this was a man called Louis Hartz. And Hartz termed this kind of adherence to Locke's views of liberalism, the way in which Americans have taken them and made them sort of, instead of being kind of a rebellious line of thought, a kind of credo for how government should work and how America should work. He called it Lockeanism. And his main contention is that American liberalism is distinct from all other forms of liberalism because America, unlike England, unlike France, etc., never had a feudal system. Feudal meaning the serfs and lords and all of that, and people kind of bound to the land. And so, unlike when Locke was writing, when there was a feudal system to rebel against, there was never that same system to rebel against in the United States, at least not for the people who are writing these guiding documents. Now, you could argue that slavery certainly has some distinctly unique qualities that kind of cut at this thesis a little bit. But for people like Thomas Jefferson, they weren't really, unfortunately, concerned with that as a problem in this regard. So unlike countries like France and England that had Enlightenment writers like Locke that were kind of rebelling against a status quo, the United States was kind of built on Enlightenment ideals and never had a true feudal tradition. So, without a true feudal tradition, Hartz argues that American liberalism is sort of a perversion of Locke. It's almost like Locke on steroids. There's no feudal system to rebel against. Each individual in America, according to Hartz, had already had the right to control his own destiny. He does not say his or her, but his own destiny. And so Locke's ideas did not have the same political consequences or application that they had when Locke was writing them. Instead, Locke's ideas were sort of adopted without the system that surrounded it, and that means that liberalism here is not a rebellion against feudalism, but rather became a dominant norm fairly quickly. Without this feudal tradition, America was not a candidate for socialist ideas like other countries, according to Hartz. And that's because he argues that socialism tends to follow a historical path that includes feudalism in its history. But this kind of gives you an idea. Hartz's kind of critique of this and placement of Locke and liberalism in America's political culture and its kind of political DNA gives you an idea for why maybe countries accept liberalism a little bit differently and why liberalism in the United States is a little bit different. But that doesn't mean that liberalism is the only political strain of thought that is influential. Certainly we have classical liberalism from Locke and from writers like Locke, that society is the product of individuals and the highest good is individual liberties. Government is a means to an end. So stressing freedoms over civic participation, liberties over duties. And the dominant thinker, of course, is Locke. But we also, from the founding era and from the drafting of the Constitution and certainly the Federalist Papers, have this notion of republicanism. Republicanism is the idea that society is the product of people kind of coming together and giving up freedom to live in relative peace in exchange for civic rights and duties. And so we've had different strains of civic republicanism or just republicanism broadly over time. There's ancient republicanism, there's Enlightenment era republicanism, and coming off the heels of that is kind of this, what I've labeled here revolutionary, but it's really founding era republicanism, like Madison, like Hamilton, who talk about the idea that society is the product of people coming together, giving up certain rights or certain freedoms to get other rights in a society, that there is a common good to be served. These two ideas, with others, kind of meld into this concrete tension that underlies a lot of our political discussion even today. So we had, and we'll read some of the arguments leading up to the adoption of the Constitution, the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalists. But those are ideas that have continued to today. They really kind of inherently flavor everything we do. This notion of whether it is better to give people freedom or give people kind of something through society that can't be given individually. And to add on kind of one extra layer here before we talk more concretely about the 21st century, there's this important notion we should probably touch on about American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism is the idea that America is somehow unique from other countries, and it is better than other countries, that it is somehow superior. There's a notion of being a kind of chosen country, and it has this exceptionalism has very deep roots in our political culture. This is starting with the revolution moving forward. This is important because it actually has affected our political discourse from the beginning. It influences the ways in which citizens view the world and view the possibilities of government around them. So it changes kind of the tenor and sometimes the impact of policy decisions. For example, we don't tend to like to hear about what Europeans are doing, on the whole, if you think of America as an aggregate, because we feel like we are exceptional. Well, socialized medicine may work there, but it won't work here because, right? That's kind of the typical response to some of these things. We are so exceptionally different, and therefore we are unique, and other policies, other ideas won't work here. And so there's something to be said about America being different. America has the strongest military in the world. It has certain freedoms that don't exist elsewhere. The First Amendment's free speech guarantees and freedom of religion guarantees are somewhat unique, especially in kind of the extent to which they are protected. But there are also other claims that, you can maybe disprove or prove, but people are willing to cling to them, like America has the best educational system or has the most innovative economy, or things like that. So we have this notion that America is different and distinct, and in America, like every country, is different and distinct. Um, but it's not just the fact that America is different. American exceptionalism is that it is better than. And as you can see from the political cartoon here, it's the notion that we are somehow distinct and therefore cannot be compared to. And this influences the way in which we are able to incorporate what other countries have done into our political discourse, and also kind of the path dependence of our choices. Things like we've always done it this way, therefore we have to always do it this way. So there are a lot of kind of fundamentally strong views about America that are built on this notion of American exceptionalism. So here we are in the 21st century, in the year 2020, kind of a little bit hard to believe that we're here. And it's impossible to talk about ideology. It's impossible to talk about political culture without talking about political partisanship. Now, it used to be that you could talk about ideology in distinct, although somewhat related terms to partisanship, because Democrats and Republicans used to be far less homogeneous amongst themselves than they are now. In fact, what has happened is that there's kind of two distinct things going on. One is that people are identifying with parties a lot less in recent decades. There's a lack of tangible benefits to actually identify with a party, and a lot of times it's easier to say you're an independent. It kind of has this noble sounding phrasing behind it, right? I'm independent and therefore you can't buy my vote, you can't sway my mind, that type of thing. So people tend not to overtly identify with parties, although what the research tends to bear out is that people who call themselves independents actually do lean one way or another. They just have labeled themselves as such. Nevertheless, party identification, certainly party membership, has declined in recent years. But, and this is a very important but, party ideology has solidified over the past 50 years or so. This, can be talked about in terms of polarization, but it also is kind of a certain self-selection, that there are safer districts now, whether this is because of gerrymandering, and we'll talk about that this semester, or because of the way in which people have sorted themselves. There are many districts where we know that's going to be a Democratic district, that's going to be a Republican district for Congress. And when that happens, the people who represent those districts are free to act in more extreme ways politically than they would if they had to appeal to the median voter, someone who was more moderate. Also, new issues have divided the parties in new ways over the past few decades, abortion being one, same sex marriage being another. Certainly, some form of socialized or government provided health care being yet another one, that have created kind of new lines in the sand where people feel like I cannot associate with that party because of this or these issues. And so effectively, we have polarized ourselves into two camps, whether we like it or not, that there's really not a viable third or fourth or fifth option. It's kind of that we've pulled ourselves to these polar opposites. And that influences a great deal of what we do. So our readings this week focus on the way in which parties, partisanship, and ideology influence the decisions that we make and the things that we believe about government. One of the first readings I want to draw your attention to, and the one that I'm going to spend the most time on here in this video, is the American Political Science Association's assessment of political parties in 1950, called Toward a More Responsible Two-Party System. This is sort of an advisory piece that was kind of given as a warning for what could happen in a two-party system that becomes stagnant and does not adequately capture the needs of the public. So as early as 1950, political scientists were becoming concerned about this idea that there was this growing polarization going on, that political parties were becoming very distinct in their issue areas, and that this distinctness, while acceptable, might lead to a stagnant system in which parties aren't actually helping solve political issues. At the end of the day, political parties are there to help refine ideas. And so they are there to refine public attitudes about policy, about candidates, right? To give us new information and talking points. That's actually a good thing, right? To have new ideas and kind of say, okay, this is the benefit of this, or this is the downfall of this. Political parties also can advocate for certain policies. They can advocate for, lowered government spending or increased taxes on the wealthy in a way that's clear and distinct and gives clear policy alternatives. And political parties, at their core in the American system, effectuate representation. Now, political parties were never kind of calculated into the constitutional system we have, but they exist nonetheless, because parties have existed pretty much since we initiated the Constitution. We went ahead and ratified it, and then all of a sudden political parties start sprouting up pretty much. They are the way in which we decide who the candidates are for a certain position. And so they don't necessarily have to be bad things. They're just vehicles for getting to know candidates and kind of seeing distinction amongst issue areas and policy stances. So that is the role of political parties. In a two-party system, parties should and the APSA says must be able to introduce new policy programs. They have to give us new examples of what should be done. They cannot remain stagnant and just maintain the status quo, but actually must provide us with new paths. And the second thing the APSA says is that parties must be able to effectuate such programs, that it's not enough to just say we should have single-payer health care in the United States, but here's how it should be done. The APSA warns, though, that there are four, in particular, dangers of a stagnant two-party system. The first is that a stagnant two-party system will lead to good programs failing. This happens because Public support cannot be rallied around a certain policy, and therefore, because people are too busy fighting, people can't work to better a policy solution. Let me give you an example of this. After the Affordable Care Act was passed and was being implemented, we eventually got to the point where the individual mandate was coming down and people had to buy health insurance either through their employer or other types of plans, or they could go on the marketplace through healthcare.gov. Well, the website was a spectacular failure. It kind of became the cliche for how government cannot get big things done, especially with technology. That said, what could have happened more quickly is that the website could have been up and running a little more quickly, or maybe new solutions could have been found, or people could rally around kind of a refinement of the program if the parties at least agreed to here are our policy stances instead of kind of this infighting about whether we should have the individual mandate at all. Even within the Democratic Party, there was fighting about this as well. So one example of the way in which good programs can fail, or in this case, falter. Number two is that we have this growth of what is called the imperial presidency. People, when Congress cannot get its act together and parties cannot effectuate change within Congress, people turn to the president to make things happen. And that has led to a growth in presidential powers and presidential influence over time, to the point where the presidency is viewed by many as the strongest branch in the government. Now, we all know that this is not what the framers intended. They intended that Congress should be the strongest branch of the government. But the growth of the imperial presidency occurs because political parties cannot effectuate change and prop up good policies and provide alternatives within Congress. Third, they say the two parties that are left will no longer be respected and will end up disintegrating. And we can see effects of this today, that the parties, even amongst loyalists at many times, are not viewed as strong and appropriate organizations for channeling political change, but almost as like a necessary evil, kind of how Locke views government itself. And then finally, the inability for the two political parties, if we have a two-party system, the inability of those two parties for consistent action in a meaningful way for programs may allow extremists to take over the political realm and ignore the public good. That extremism isn't bred from outside the party system, but actually in a stagnant system where the parties aren't doing what they should be doing, can allow extremists to come up within the parties that in a way that's destabilizing for the government. So I'll leave it up to you whether you think the APSA had a point in 1950 and maybe whether some of their predictions have come true as we sit here in 2020. Certainly would be good backup for your debate this week or your blog post next week. One other idea before we check out this week, and I'm going to kind of fit the other readings into this as they are examples of something, is this idea of negative partisanship. This is the idea that you are more anti one party than pro your own party. That if you identify as a Republican, for example, that identification is driven heavily by a hatred or disdain for Democrats rather than kind of a genuine belief in what the Republican Party stands for, or vice versa. This also can mean that your identification is just more strongly rooted in negative feelings overall. Part of the problem with negative partisanship is not just the things that the APSA warned about, that political parties won't be able to effectuate change, but that it affects your view of the world and of things that happen in the world. So our other three readings this week, Lazarus, Levine, and Greenblatt, are all examples of partisanship shaping how we view the world, how we view different things that occur. And we hear a lot today about how, oh, if Obama had done this, Republicans would have lost their mind, or if, Obama hadn't done this, then Democrats would have lost their mind, that kind of thing. And we can see this in these three readings, right? One of them deals with the firing of Jim Comey, and the ways in which, and the another one deals with the ways in which it seems like partisanship has allowed for issues to sort of flip after parties change control of the presidency. So partisanship and this kind of notion of negative partisanship and the way in which the parties do not act the same way in which they did previously allows us to view the world in a very negative way, and also allows us to justify things that we might not have justified otherwise. So for this week, and of course, I thought since we're using partisanship, why not include Pelosi's little hand clap at the last State of the Union address? And I will leave Christine Pelosi, her daughter, to explain how she feels about it. So make sure you do the reading summaries for the 4 readings. And we are having our first debate this week. I am going to put up a separate quick 5-minute video about the debate, but here are some key reminders. First, you need to have your first substantive comment up by Thursday at noon. The sooner the better on this one. It should be about a paragraph or so. You need at least 2 follow-up points or rebuttals to people's critique of your point or critiques of other people's points by Sunday at 11:59 p.m. when our week wraps up. And the sides for the debate are going to be posted under this week's materials on Blackboard as well. So I'll post it there. I'll also probably put it in the thread just so it's right there, easy to go. Make sure that you're arguing your assigned side. I know people might have feelings about the question that are more personal, and you've started to develop those, and that's great. But remember, the assignment is to argue the side you are given. And so make sure that you are looking at that before you do the work. All right, that is it for this week. I will leave you with those thoughts, and I will check in via the debate. Bye-bye.